I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. I want to welcome you to City Hall for our monthly Hungry for History program. There's a few new faces here. Come on in. I'm Luciana Spraker. I'm the director with the city's Municipal Archives, which is located here on City Hall's first floor. If you've never visited us, don't visit us in the next 2 weeks because we're busy moving. So, not moving from City Hall, moving some other stuff. But please come visit us after St. Patrick's Day. Is that good, Kelly? Yes. I'm really excited about our program today. It ties into our current exhibit on the first floor rotunda. If you didn't get a chance to see that as you're coming in, please stop and look at the exhibit on your way out. It's called Laws Murphy's. It features works by Christopher Murphy Jr. from the W.W. Law Art Collection. We decided to display those pieces because there's an exhibit at the Jepson Center that Courtney curated, and I'm going to let her tell you about that exhibit. So it was just a nice tie-in to what they were doing at the Telfair Museums. And then since Courtney curated that exhibit, it was a great opportunity to have her come and talk about Christopher Murphy and his work as well. So do stop on your way out and look at Laws Murphy's. It's going to be on display through June here at City Hall. And then to present our program today, A Love Letter to Savannah, City Views and Street Scenes by Christopher Murphy Jr. We're happy to have Courtney McNeil. Courtney is the Chief Curator and Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs at Telfair Museums. She's responsible for oversight of Telfair's programmatic activities, which includes collections, exhibitions, and education. In this role, she annually directs a schedule of 15 to 20 exhibitions and the accompanying programming. She's been with Telfair's Curatorial Department since 2006 and holds a BA from Georgetown University and an MA from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. So, Courtney.
Thank you, Luciana, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming out today to spend a little time over lunch talking about art and Savannah and Christopher Murphy. So I'm really thrilled to be able to be here to speak today. I've been thinking a lot about Christopher Murphy and the other artists from Savannah of that time period as I was organizing the exhibition that Luciana mentioned, which is launching Savannah's art scene, the founders of the Savannah Art Club. And that's on view over at the Jepson Center for the next couple of months. So please check that exhibition out. It's drawn almost entirely from Telfair's permanent collection with the idea of looking at those founding decades. The Savannah Art Club was founded in February of 1920. It still exists today as the Savannah Art Association. And the exhibition looks at those founding decades of the 20s and the 30s, the art in Telfair's collection from that period, and what it says about the state of the community for artists at that time and how it's led to such a wonderful and vibrant artistic community that we all enjoy being a part of today here in Savannah. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the wonderful research on Murphy and his peers that's been conducted by past Telfair curators, including Holly Coons and Faye Shellman-Coleman, particularly the research that they did for the 2008 exhibition, Picturing Savannah, the Art of Christopher A.D. Murphy, on which I had the great pleasure of assisting, and that was soon after I started at the museum, and it was my first introduction to Murphy's work. And since that time, since 2008, and that lengthy engagement with him for this project, I've grown to appreciate and love his work even more. So today I would like to talk first about Murphy and his family and his early life, then move on to an overview of his street scenes and city views in general, and then finish with a look at the Murphy works in the on view downstairs from the W.W. Law collection, and how we can find some parallels between the artistic passion of Christopher Murphy and the preservation interests of W.W. Law. You know, two different men kind of united in one area of passion. So the man that we refer to as Christopher Murphy Jr. was born Christopher Aristide de Bouillon Murphy in 1902. He's seen in the picture here being held by his father, who's seated there. His father was Christopher Patrick Hussey Murphy. So we also sometimes refer to them as Christopher A.D. Murphy and Christopher P.H. Murphy, since he wasn't technically a junior, since they had different middle names. But for ease of speech today, I will call them senior and junior. And then on the left-hand side, we see Murphy's mother, Lucille de Bouillon Murphy, holding two of Murphy's younger sisters. This photograph was taken around 1907, and Murphy's parents would go on to have 4 additional children over the next few years, making Murphy finally the eldest of 7 children. His mother and his father were descended from French and Irish immigrants, respectively. Both of those sides of the family came to Savannah around the middle of the 19th century. His Irish grandfather had had a ship chandlery and a commercial painting business, and his French grandparents were a milliner and a jeweler. And a lot of people think that this firmly middle-class background for Murphy, which distinguished him from many artists, traditionally the people who have the time to make art and the resources to travel and see art and study art are traditionally the wealthy elite. But Murphy's background was pretty firmly middle-class, and I think that really helped him to be more closely attuned to Savannah as a site of industry and labor. So shortly after that family photograph was taken, within about the next year or so, the Murphy family moved to this home here at 11 East Perry Street, right off of Chippewa Square. Murphy Sr. had taken over his father's business and had shifted it more towards specialty painting and decorating, and he had his office next door at 13 East Perry Street, which is now the site of Fire Street Food, to put it in context. Murphy Sr. also had a studio in the basement of this home at 11 East Perry Street. Both the father and the mother were artists themselves, and the father pursued art in his spare time while he was also keeping his business running. Murphy's mother actually studied formally under Carl Brandt, Telfair Academy's first director, and she and he both continued drawing, painting, talking about art, exposing their children to art, even as their family life and their family business grew busier. So I should point out that Lucille gave birth to her 7 children over a 10-year period, which just sounds so exhausting to me. And it seems a small miracle that she still managed to, to make art, to have correspondence with family about art and their shared passions for art. So young Christopher absolutely grew up in a family household that made art, valued art, and discussed art. And here's one painting by Murphy Sr. of Murphy Jr. I love this work. This is in the collection of Christopher Murphy Jr.'s son, who's still living, who lives in the Washington, D.C. area. And this shows young Christopher Jr. at the Telfair Academy in around 1918. So this is a wonderful window into the artistic world of Savannah at this time, and I think it visually makes a really clear statement about how I can stand up here and say Murphy was exposed to art as a child, but we have it documented here. He was at the museum. He was exposed to these works of art from around the world that had been collected and brought to Savannah over the prior few decades. Telfair was founded in 1886, and it was the first public art museum in the South, and really one of the first in the entire country, which I think is something we don't do a good enough job talking about and celebrating. So the artistic scene in Savannah was vibrant even in Murphy's early years. This is a view of one of the visiting instructors for the Savannah Art Club, a man named Elliot Clark, who is the very dapper gentleman in those white bloomers there off to the right-hand side. He was a well-known artist based in New York who came down to teach classes for the Savannah Art Club, as many artists did. And we believe that young Christopher Jr. is the man at the far right with that little straw hat on. It's mostly female art students you'll see in this photograph, but there were a few men as well. And so we do believe that that's Murphy Jr. over at the right-hand side. We know that Murphy also studied under Hilda Belcher, another prominent visiting artist, when she came to town to teach for the Savannah Art Club. But the thing that's really crucial about Murphy that sets him apart from other Savannah artists in this time period was that, days after his graduation from Benedictine Military School in 1921, he left for New York and went off to study art. I think for both of his parents, this was something that they supported and were excited about. Murphy Sr. was really passionate about art, but never had the chance to travel and to study formally. So, he was clearly, in a way, living vicariously through his son and giving him this opportunity to go to New York and study. These are 2 examples of works in Telfair's collection that Murphy painted in New York in the 1920s. And they're both really small in scale. They have a very spontaneous, fresh quality to them, which lends me to think that they were likely painted outdoors in front of the subject that he sees. They have a real immediacy to them. But while he was in New York, he enrolled at the Art Students League. He studied under George Bridgman, Henry Rittenberg, Frank Dumond, and Joseph Pennell, the teacher of etching, most notably, I think. He also had an early interest in architecture, and we'll see that in his later works when he's back in Savannah. Fascinated by Savannah's architecture, and he attended evening classes at the Society of Beaux-Arts Architects, and this was a group of architects who'd study at the Academy of Beaux-Arts in Paris and then brought their training here to the United States to share that Beaux-Arts training with American architectural students who didn't have the ability to travel to Europe and continue their studies there. So he's learning about architecture from architects, he's learning about art from artists, and just soaking everything in like a sponge. He also attended special lectures when they happened by artists like Robert Henry, and it's fantastic to look at his letters home where he's, writing to his parents who totally get it, right? They're artists, they love this as much as Murphy does. You wouldn't believe the things that Henry was saying and really trying to share those experiences with his family back in Savannah. So he spent about a decade alternating between New York, coming home to Savannah when classes weren't in session, and helping out with his father's business. So it was really so after about 10 years, so in the 1930s, during the Depression, the economy was such that he felt he really had to be back in Savannah full time, helping with the family business, and couldn't afford to be, gallivanting off in New York and studying art. So he returned home. He really ensconced himself in the artistic world of Savannah, and Savannah would be his muse for the rest of his career. But these are two portraits that Murphy Jr. painted of two of his immediate family members. So the artistic talent did not just stop with him. His sister Margaret was also a really accomplished artist, and in fact, she probably had more professional training in art than any of the Murphy family members. And we do have one work of hers on view in the Savannah Art Club show. That's on view right now. And then on the left, you can see Murphy Sr., and it's wonderful that his son has painted him as he wished to be seen, as an artist, holding his paintbrushes with the painting leaning casually in the background. This was his hobby, not his profession, but this is how he wanted to be portrayed in the painting. And you can see a real genuine warmth, I think, in both of these paintings, and the elegance of that green hat always gets me. But aside from these two works, most of the works I want to show you today are street scenes. But of course, I have to come full circle. So his father painted that early portrait of young Murphy at the Academy as a child. And then here is a work that Murphy himself painted. So, by one of my favorite artists, and it's of two of my favorite paintings in Telfair's collection. You have this great sense that Murphy has just kind of gotten up from that chair where he's contemplating the surroundings of the Telfair Academy to make this quick little oil sketch. So he, this firmly locates him as part of the artistic circles at Telfair, at the Savannah Art Club, and he exhibited in Savannah throughout the state, throughout the country, but Savannah was his muse and his passion. So one area where he really differed from a lot of the Savannah artists in this time period is that he was doing a lot of etching. Now, etching is not something you can just dabble in. I'm not an artist, but I could pick up a pencil and try to sketch something. You can't just casually happen to make an etching, right? Because you need the paper, you need the printing press, you need the chemicals, you need the metal plates and the special tools. I think the fact that he embraced etching so passionately kind of suggests that he's trying to either consciously or subconsciously differentiate himself from some of the more amateur artists in Savannah. So he was a really talented etcher. I mentioned before he studied with Joseph Pennell, who was best pals with Whistler and really influential to Whistler's printmaking, which is saying a lot because Whistler did not have friends. He was famously cantankerous. But Pennell would have been a really fantastic mentor to Murphy if he hadn't died a few years after Murphy got to New York. But still, you can see the influence of Pennell's architectural etchings here in their spontaneous quality, in their intimacy, and in the way that he can really fully delineate and suggest architectural forms, but with really spare lines. So on either side, we have two of Telfair's buildings. On the left, we have the Telfair Academy. On the right is the rear view of the Owens Thomas House building. And then in the middle is an etching titled Humble Homes. I think this selection here, and all of these they're small in scale, as etchings tend to be. These really show Murphy's broad interest in Savannah's architecture. He loved, these elegant facades, the homes of the wealthy elite, but he was just as affectionate in his portrayal of humble homes or everyday vernacular structures that line Savannah's streets. And one thing I love about his work, his etchings, his drawings, paintings, almost every single one of them, it's not even an architectural view, is not bare of activity. They're almost always figures or people just going about their daily lives. Even if it's just a few strokes of the etching needle suggesting these forms, it gives a vibrancy to his compositions, and it makes them feel active and populated. This work here, Ancient Skyscrapers, is a view on River Street. I think the title's a little tongue-in-cheek, right? They're not exactly ancient here, but they may have felt like that to him at the time, considering the state of the condition that he found them in. He's also really interested in these contrasts, the different sizes of the buildings, the areas of light and dark, and even contrast in subject matter, as we'll see going on a little further. This view here is an alley with a coal car in Savannah and is a really great example of Murphy's interest in industry and everyday life and labor in the city. This work and the one before are from the collection of the Morris Museum of Art in Augusta. And proud as I am of the Telfair for many, many things, the Morris Museum has a better collection of Christopher Murphy work than we do. They had the good fortune to have the resources to make acquisitions, and you can see the dates on these acquisitions are in the 1990s, and they had funding at that time to really actively collect work by Southern artists. Telfair was late to this party, for sure. You know, we were exhibiting work by Savannah artists. We were closely partnering with the Savannah Art Club and showing their members work and hosting their meetings and their classes, but we weren't seriously collecting Savannah art really until, not at all until maybe the 70s, but not in a serious way until the late 90s, early 2000s probably, when we really took stock of the quality of work that was done here in Savannah and our institutional obligation to tell that story and to be the authority in town on the history of artists living and working in our community. All that to say, I'm a little jealous of the Morris Museum, but they're great colleagues, and they did lend us everything that we needed to borrow from them for the Murphy retrospective that we did in '08. This is a work here. It's a study for a later work called Under the Cotton Exchange, and it's a great example of Murphy's working process. You can see how he has just sketched out this idea. He's really interested in this, the shadow being cast down, and the sort of the darkness underneath and that bright light coming in from above. And again, you've got the figures. Think about when you look at his works, look at them as they are, and then mentally kind of take away the figures and just reflect on how that changes the feeling that you get from his work. Here, up from the waterfront, from the Morris Museum, also relates to other works that he's done. You have these really loose, brushy trees, the wonderful shadows cast by the wall there, and the shadows cast of the figures who are walking up the ramp. And then similar sort of composition. In this case, we're looking down, descending down, this building in the background, a study for a painting called On the Bay. And then this one's really charming, I think, for its unfinished quality. Here he's showing the Old City Market around 1925. And I think the fact that Murphy was so interested in recording everyday life in and around Savannah, it meant that he was, whether he intended to or not, recording how the streets of Savannah looked at this time for posterity. So buildings that we've lost, like the Old City Market, we can now see them, and not just what the architecture looked like, but how cars moved around it, how people interacted with the building. So he's recording how these buildings functioned in the path of everyday life in Savannah. And then this one, again, we see this idea. This one's actually titled Different Levels, and you can see, just like the Under the Cotton Exchange and the study for On the Bay, this kind of idea of descending. You can see the stairs going down. You can see the activity in the foreground at the lower level, and then he tiers it all the way up. Another common feature in his work is that he's interested not just in architecture as this stagnant thing, or a building as an immobile, unchanging unit to be recorded, but he's interested in moments of destruction, of construction, of change. And here you can see an excavation, the beginnings of some construction work, presumably, with the Telfair Academy in the background there. It's the sort of subject that some artists would skip past, thinking, well, we'll wait for all this work to be finished. I'll draw the finished product. But no, he's interested in the process. He's interested in the very fact of change itself within his beloved city, recognizing that some change must happen, but at times also lamenting changes that resulted in the loss of historic structures. So he was an early thinker in preservation, for sure. So far I focused primarily on his drawings and his etchings, but he was also really skilled in rendering city views and street scenes in oil paint and in color. I've got a couple of really nice examples here. And I think you can see this was a talented artist, right? These are the coloration here, the composition, the cropping, the way the activity with the two figures is a little bit off center, the interplay of the white buildings with the black rectangular shapes of the windows. It all just functions really well as a work of art. I think if I had to pick, I might pick his drawings and etchings as my favorite types of work by him, because there is a spontaneous and immediate quality to them that you just lose in a painting, because the painting has to feel a little bit more rehearsed and practiced at times. That being said, I love this painting. Mr. Gaynor sadly passed away a few years ago, and I think this painting has left Savannah with his heirs, and that it's something I lament for sure. Another noteworthy Savannah scene painting is this image here. This is actually the work that we used on the cover of our book back in '08. And this is another great example of a beautiful city street scene, but also populated with figures. He's interested in this street as a site of activity. He's interested in the shadows and how the shadows reflect across the road. Like the French Impressionists, who were at that time well known and established and had been exhibited here in Savannah. He's looking at shadows and seeing not black, but he's seeing blue, he's seeing purple, he's seeing hints of pink at times in these shadows, and really exploring that color. And so, although I'm focusing on city scenes and street views, I did want to present a couple of maritime views as well. Oh, thank you. I'm running out of room for all my notes. Because they do relate to this idea of work and labor and industry in the city. So these are two views, one from Telfair's collection and one from the Morris Museum, of the ship the Antioch docking. And it really gives a great window into how the Port of Savannah operated in the 1920s, but it at the same time references how the economy was changing at that time. So you see the steamship in the foreground, and then off in the background, more so in Telfair's work on the right, but kind of just hinted at over there, is the outdated sailing ship that would be replaced over time by the steamships that were in the foreground. So he's kind of commenting on this change. I also love the pink color of the water, and the boats he had the same in both versions. So presumably the pen and ink was a study for the painting, and it's fun looking at a study and seeing what the artist looks at and says, all right, I nailed this, I'm going to keep this the same, but I want to make some revisions here. So he really changed the composition a lot when he went to the final painting. He really reduced the impact, he really increased the impact of the sailing ship masts in the background, but those figures in the boats he kept almost identical in that pink water. And then jumping ahead to the port around 1942, so many of Murphy's works, because they're so specific architecturally and with so many details, you can locate them at a certain time, a really specific time period. So this work we think was around the time of 1942. So during the Second World War, the Savannah River was an important security location. So the waterfront became a restricted area from 1942 until the close of the war, as the military was worried about the presence of German U-boats off the Atlantic coast. So on the river at that time, there were exchanges at the port with Great Britain, the production of Victory ships at shipyards located just east of the city. And here we can see a view of the river drawn from a River Street balcony, possibly from an artist's studio overlooking the river, of which there were many at that time. And you can see a British vessel flying the Royal Navy white ensign flag on its stern on the left. To the right, a U.S. military ship, maybe a Coast Guard vessel. And then Murphy has also included an American flag flying from one of the flagpoles that often dotted balcony windows along the riverfront. So, because of that British flag there, we're pretty sure it dates to that roughly World War II period. But there are also civilians on River Street. So this is either just before they locked down River Street and restricted access in 42, or just after the end of the war. Again, here we have Barnard Street slip from around 1925, so going back to that period of the Antioch docking. So this is a subject that Murphy returned to many different times in different media with different areas of focus as well. And then here we have this view of Presbyterian Church from a garden. So what I'd point out about this view is that it's not your typical straightforward portrait of a church from the front, not very interpretive or creative. He's much more interested in situating the church in its context and showing the foliage of the trees and the streets and the walls and the things that surround it. So he's looking at these buildings not in isolation, but how they function in the ecosystem of Savannah. Not to say he didn't also do some more of these traditional views. Early in his career, he did a whole series of, famous doorways of Savannah, this lovely sort of straightforward portfolio of drawings of some of the finer homes in Savannah. And here we have another example. These are primarily pen and ink drawings showing St. John the Baptist, St. John's Episcopal Church, and Independent Presbyterian Church here in Savannah from fairly traditional viewpoints. But then he mixes things up a bit in this other view of the Presbyterian spire from a garden, because you can see workers in the foreground. So again, you have the continuity of the church spire and that icon of the Savannah city scene, contrasting with the ever-present work and change and restoration and demolition of the built environment here in Savannah. So that brings me to, these are two images of the first Congregational church in Whitfield Square. This building was first constructed in 1895. The steeple that you see on the right actually was blown off in a storm in 1940, and then the church was renovated in 1968, and the steeple was replaced in 1992. So I was not in Savannah before 1992, so I only have ever known this church with the little steeple that's on there now. It looks a lot like this, but it's a little smaller in scale. And so looking at these works, I think the more likely explanation is that the work without the steeple was painted after 1940 and the one with the steeple was painted beforehand. But we can't rule out the possibility that perhaps Murphy painted the steeple from memory later on. But he was really interested in this church and painted it several different times, and we'll look at a few more in a minute as we transition to talk about the city's holdings from the W.W. Law Collection. So I hope that you have seen enough of Murphy's views of Savannah to start to think about how the work and the street views of Murphy connect to the story and the passions and the interest of Savannah's prominent civil rights leader, W.W. Law. So a little bit of background on Law. Wesley Wallace Law lived from 1923 to 2002, so he was about a generation younger than Murphy, but they absolutely overlapped for several decades of their lives, both living here in Savannah. Law was born in Savannah and became involved in the youth council of the NAACP when he was still in high school. He attended Savannah State, where he earned a degree in biology, but not before his education was interrupted by service in the U.S. Army during World War II. He was also very active at First Bryan Baptist Church and worked as a U.S. mail carrier for more than 40 years. But most notably, he was president of Savannah's chapter of the NAACP from 1950 through 1976. So those really critical and crucial years of desegregation and the civil rights movement here. And after 1976, when he stepped down from his NAACP role, is when he really turned his energy and his attention to researching, celebrating, and preserving the histories of Savannah's African American community. And his achievements in this area are many. And thank you, Luciana, for the wonderful law bio on the city's website that gives this laundry list that I'll just run through. When his achievements include establishing the Savannah Yamacraw branch of the Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and History, founding of the King Tisdale Cottage Museum, founding the Beach Institute, founding the Ralph Mark Gilbert Civil Rights Museum, the Negro Heritage Trail Tour, and also aiding in the preservation of Laurel Grove South Cemetery. And his work in preservation was really widely recognized, receiving recognition from the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation. He also held honorary doctorate degrees from Savannah State and from SCAD. So even hearing this, even if you didn't know anything about Law before, which I'm sure you did, you can already see the parallels probably between Law's interest in preservation of Savannah's unique history and Murphy's ongoing celebration throughout his career of Savannah's streets, people, and industry. So perhaps it's not a surprise to know that among Law's many interests was his collection of art, that included 7 Savannah street scenes by Murphy. He also had a vast collection of photographs, artworks, NAACP records, audio and video recordings, music, book, periodicals, and other papers, and many other holdings that were donated to the city of Savannah by the W.W. Law Foundation after his death. And I think the city's done a fantastic job of digitizing much of that collection and making really extensive finding aids viewable online, which is fantastic. But so looking specifically at Murphy and at Law, this is the first example of one of the works by Murphy that Law collected. And one thing I would love to learn more about, which I don't know if the records exist or not, is whether Law acquired these works earlier from Murphy himself while Murphy was still alive, or after he began his interest in preservation more in earnest, so after that 1976 time. Murphy died in 1973. So by the time Law was really focusing on his work in preservation, Murphy had already passed away. But it's fascinating either way to look at his selection of works and to think about how it relates to Law's interests. So here we see the St. John Baptist Church located on Hartridge Street, the building that's also known as the Mighty Fortress. It was built in 1891 after being founded by a member of the First Bryan Baptist Church, which was Law's church, and its intent was to serve the east side of Savannah. The original church building was lost to fire in 1993 and then rebuilt later in the 1990s to a similar but a red brick structure that stands on the site today. And then here we've got Murphy's view of the St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. This is a building that was, so in 1859, the Episcopal Diocese of Savannah purchased the Unitarian Church on Oglethorpe Square for St. Stephen's Episcopal Church, which was the first Episcopal church for African Americans in the Diocese of Georgia. And then the congregation moved the church building to Troop Square and held services there until 1943. And at that time, St. Stephen's merged with St. Matthew's and St. Augustine's to form another church on the west side. So this building was sold in 1947 and is now occupied by the Unitarian Universalist Church. And then here we have a building that should look familiar. We just looked at it before, the First Congregational Church. This is one of 2 views of that church owned by Law, but I wanted to contextualize it a little for you. And here's the second view of First Congregational Church owned by Law. And here we can see in combination, the work on the left is from a private collection here in Savannah, and the work on the right is in the Law collection here at the city. So I think it's really fun to look at these 2 views of the same building, both without the steeple. So both presumably painted, well, the one on the right is dated 66. The one on the left would have had to have been sometime after 1940. And note the similarities and differences. I think they have really different color palettes. Obviously, one is a watercolor and one's an oil on canvas. And I think the compositional differences between the 2 are pretty drastic, to the extent that I don't really feel like the one on the right is a study for the one on the left, but rather an indication of just some great interest that this building held for Murphy. And then here we can see on the left the work from the Law collection at the city, and then on the right a private collection painting that was loaned to our show in 2008. Now in this case, I think they're much more closely aligned, and I could absolutely be convinced, despite the differences in orientation and composition, that one was a study for the other. It feels like the daylight is the same, the figures look really similar. You've got some differences in the foliage, I think, but overall, these 2 really lend themselves to an examination of Murphy's practice and thinking about, was he doing this smaller work on site? Was he doing it in his studio based on pencil sketches? And then how it culminated in the gouache on board painting that you see on the right. So there are a couple of other really lovely works in the city's collection as well, including this image here of the New Moon Baptist Church. And this is a church that was located in the Old Fort neighborhood east of East Broad Street, but was later demolished to build the Hitch Village public housing. And on the left, you can see the Randolph Street branch of the Savannah Pharmacy, which was the second oldest continuously operating African-American business in Savannah when it closed its Martin Luther King Jr. branch in 2007. Now, was Murphy aware of these histories when he chose to portray these subjects, or was he just equally fascinated by all neighborhoods and all the architecture of his hometown? You know, we're not really sure. But just by choosing this street scene to portray, you feel like there was some investment in it by Murphy. And then the work that I'll leave you with, the last one I'll leave you with, is this other work in the law collection done by Murphy. And this is a watercolor and Conte crayon work. And this shows the 500 block of East Charleston Street. It's undated, so we're not quite sure when it was made, but the building that you see here in this two-story frame house in the center of the view was originally constructed in 1860. So it would have been a quite well-established building and a well-established scene by the time that Murphy painted it. So in conclusion, I hope that today was a fun opportunity for you to learn a little bit more about talented Savannah artist, Christopher Murphy Jr., and particularly his passion for portraying street scenes and city views here in his hometown of Savannah. I appreciated the opportunity to think more closely about his interest in preservation and what he was trying to signify by the selection of kind of unusual subjects sometimes within the streets of Savannah, and how that ties to work by folks like W.W. Law and his ongoing interest in preservation of Savannah's untold stories. So I hope this has given you an opportunity for reflection. I hope you'll enjoy seeing the works downstairs. And for anybody who wants to wander over towards Telfair Square, we have work by Christopher Murphy on view in the sculpture gallery of the Telfair Academy. Those two little New York paintings are on view there. We have some Savannah work. The Antioch docking works are on view upstairs in one of the small galleries. And then, of course, we have work by many of the Murphys over in the Savannah Art Club show as well. That really gives you a window into the state of the arts community here in Savannah in the 1920s and 30s. So thank you so much for your attention today. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Question?
Are you familiar with the book called Savannah that he and Walter Hartridge did?
Yes, yeah, and that's, I think, a topic for a whole other talk for sure, is this partnership, a publishing partnership that Murphy had to try to, formally illustrate the story of Savannah's architecture.
His sister taught me art at Savannah High.
Fantastic. And so I'm still meeting people around Savannah who knew Murphy himself or knew his sister, because she lived until the early 2000s or the 90s. I feel like she lived quite a longer time than him, but I never had the good fortune to meet either of them. Any other questions? Yes.
Well, any interviews or other things that would answer some of your questions about him? You seem to have several questions about what his views, what he thought, how he related.
Well, that's the problem, right? The more research you do, the more questions you unearth. There are some Murphy family papers that are in the collection of Murphy's son in Washington, D.C., and he's made some of those available to us. But I don't believe there are many more records aside from that. There are a lot of Savannah Art Club records and things. I know the GHS has some papers. Can't get to them now, they're closed, but there are some sources to explore. Yes?
You mentioned that his house on Perry Street, his studio is in the lower level.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of light did he have in there?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine it would have been fantastic light, but I feel like he was kind of stringing this together, right? He had his business, he had his home, and I'm sure it was a privilege for him to be able to carve out a space at all, although it might not have been ideal. Yeah.
That is something you said he wasn't a junior.
He's commonly referred to as junior, and so for ease of communication, I will refer to him as junior. He signed some of his work junior.
I wanted to comment on that. Just so when we were doing our exhibit here at City Hall, that was a question like how we would present his name. All of the works we have in our collection were signed Christopher Murphy Jr., so that's why I chose to use the name that way.
Fantastic. Yeah, our house style is to use the AD Murphy, and we also sat down and thought about it, and I forget what the factors were. But the name technically was, Aristide Guébillon.
Did you say that the Unitarian Church was originally an African-American church?
Do you want me to answer
Yes, I'm out of my depth
So
in the history part.
originally it was built as a Unitarian church. Then the Unitarian church sold it to the Episcopal diocese, who moved the church to its current location to be St. Stephen's Episcopal Church for an African American Episcopal Church. Then that church merged with two other churches and they closed. And then for a brief while, it was another church, I can't remember. And then Unitarian Universalists bought it back, did the restoration you're probably familiar with in the 90s, and now it's a Unitarian church again. So W.W. Law did an exhibit at the King Tisdale Cottage Museum in the 1980s, which I think is how he acquired several of these paintings that focus on African American churches. So his interest in that painting is not because of the Unitarian connection, it's because of the St. Stephen's Episcopal connection.
You know where it's moved from?
Oglethorpe Square, I believe.
Square.
Yeah,
that's what-
Oglethorpe Square.
Isn't it where the Rose of Sharon is?
I'd have to go back and look at my notes, and I don't remember offhand.
In church building.
It's on Street.
Congregational church is African American now too, is that always been?
The Congregational Church membership was formed in connection to the Beach Institute. So Mr. Law's interest in it was because of its relationship with the Beach Institute and the American Missionary Association. So all of the churches in his collection have African American historical ties.
Except St. John the Baptist.
The Mighty Fortress, yes.
The question I had was about W.W. Law's acquisition of those. He didn't have any notes that said why he was, about the acquisition. They simply appeared in his collection that the city got.
Unfortunately, we do not have acquisition notes. What we have are notes about his interests and his shows that he curated. So for the show he had, and I'm sorry I don't remember the name of the title of the exhibit, but he talked about the purpose of it was to tell the story of these African American churches, and there were a couple of other Murphy pieces that were listed as being part of the show that weren't in his personal collection at home. So the collection we have are the pieces that were in his personal collection at his home. So we don't really know how he acquired them, whether they ended up being gifts, whether he purchased them. There are other pieces at the Beach Institute that are part of their collection. Unfortunately, there's not good acquisition notes.
And I would point out that sometimes folks think, oh, well, these W.W. Law works weren't in the Looking Back show in 2008. They weren't in the catalog. Does that mean that they're thought to be less important? And I would say that's not the case at all. The works weren't with the city at that time, right? I think they were still tied up with the estate. So when we were researching the exhibition, we actually did not have access to and information about those works. And if we had, we would have loved to have borrowed them for our show.
The city, just to clarify that, the city acquired this collection in 2014. And as we are processing a 2,000 cubic foot collection, we are opening portions of the collection up to the public. So the art collection is fully open. So if you want to see any pieces of that collection, you can come into the archives and see it. And I wanted to mention that the pieces that are on display in the rotunda, with the exception of one, are reproductions because we wanted to blow them up to make them bigger for our space. So if you want to see the originals, just let us know and we can pull those out for you. And we also, in addition to what's on display, we do have some of the prints of some of the etchings as well. So we have some additional Murphys that you didn't see in this presentation.
I'm very interested in Murphy's sort of lost Savannah pictures, but some of which that's finding sort of the Frogtown painting that you showed, and just some of the other like back alleys. And I'm curious if there has ever been any effort made to try to match up either on maps or with current photos where those locations are more specifically, and this when Frogtown was a huge African American working class neighborhood on the west side that pretty much got wiped out. Basically everything east or west of MLK, where the roundhouse and all of that stuff is now. Well, not the roundhouse, but north of there. And there's the whole African American men's social club called Frogtown something or other, and I don't know exactly what it is, but the late Henry Moore, who was assistant city manager here, he was a member of it, and it's sort of an invitational organization. You probably know all about that. Yeah. It's based on the Frogtown community. So,
Clever.
anyway, I mean, and we just have this little sketch. That's kind of all that's there.
Yeah, I think there's definitely more work to be done. We did some of that work in the lead up to the 2008 exhibition, so there's a little more information in there. But as art historians, we took a very art historical approach to that show. Something we could have done with more resources would have been to partner with a historian or an architectural historian to really dig into the nitty gritty of the architecture, which maybe is my idea for the next time we look at Murphy. We'll take that kind of approach. It's always interesting to work in an interdisciplinary way when you can. I think it brings new life to museum shows. Thank you. Yeah, there's more to do.
Thank you, Courtney. It was wonderful. Just curiously, the works seem to be very small.
Yeah, a lot of the works are pretty small. So, etchings, usually were about this big, maybe up to this big. Sketches were about the size of a sheet of notebook paper. The paintings were a little bit bigger, but he worked on a pretty modest scale. He did.
Is that because of cost of materials, or?
And probably also the market as well. He was selling his work, I think, broadly to the Savannah population, but not to grand palaces that had massive walls. So he was probably painting where the demand was. That's the scale of work that's also in keeping with most of the Savannah Art Club artists who were working in the city at that time. So it was kind of the going expected dimensions around town in exhibitions and things.
Thank you.
Did Murphy become an artist full-time, or did he continue to work in the family business as well?
Yeah, he worked pretty much full-time as an artist. Okay. He dedicated his life to the arts.
Janet, does the city have the catalog of that W.W. Law exhibition at the King Tisdale? The one that...
I have an exhibition list that I'd be happy to share with you.
Great, well, if there are no other questions, thank you so much for